Right, it's time to take a baby step forward in this series. We've got to an evocative position where we noted last day that movement science shows us moving like gods, basically, and behaviour science judges us as moving like scoundrels, as behaving like scoundrels, but that's not terribly practical or helpful. I want to do more with this series of videos. The book The Blind Spot has opened up a space for a conversation in which the concerns of embodiment can be placed on the table in a manner which is relevant to our understanding of what a physicalist framework is, and what we can hope from a physicalist framework, and what we can hope from an embodied position. Now, when it comes to talk of consciousness and experience, normally we find ourselves in the realm of epistemology. Experience, which is not addressable within a physicalist framework, is usually discussed in terms of senses and concepts. Now, we made a very important point last time that the traditional way of talking about the senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching, is fine. It's a very good way of talking about the senses. What it does not do is map onto our objectivized construction of the body. We don't find the five senses as five distinguished kinds of neural receptors or five distinct kinds of paths, for example. So in going forward, I will be using the senses in an everyday manner, and this seems to be a good way of talking about the senses. It has arisen in other traditions too, and I'm very interested in how other traditions beyond the physicalist tradition talk about things. Concepts are abstract. Concepts are words. Let's discuss the concept. I'm using it right now. You would never find it anywhere in this room I'm in. By evoking the word concept, I'm speaking the word concept. By hearing the word concept, it arrives at you, and maybe it means something and maybe it doesn't. And if it meant something, maybe you reuse it, and maybe you will use the word concept and someone else receives it. If concepts have any reality at all, it's in this production, reception, and transmission. They're not reified things to be found inside here. But senses and concepts is not enough. We need one more thing. Now, this has been suggested, and no one quite knows how to suggest it. It's been suggested from many quarters. I found it this morning, for example. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician in the 17th century, was suggesting it. And that is that we need also to consider the imagination. So I'm going to take seriously the idea that this fictive object, the brain, onto which we produce something, is an organ of the imagination. That might be actually a helpful, if challenging, notion to work with. Now that might seem to be an absurd position to put yourself in. If we're not trafficking in the idealizations of the treating the brain as if it was a standalone object, as if it was one thing without another in the body, and we're not employing the usual reduction of things to a physicalist framework, how do we speak? It's a very good question. But it is important to practice speaking so. It is notoriously difficult to reify experience, but that doesn't mean experience isn't the most wonderful and important thing. Now, funnily enough, this move has happened at least twice before. It happened in mathematics with the invention of complex numbers, or as they are sometimes known, imaginary numbers. Imagine that. We've already wondered whether the numbers are real, and here they are coming along and using imaginary numbers. And for a while everyone went, they're imaginary, you just made them up, unlike the numbers that we have, which we know are real. And funny enough, that distinction went away in complex numbers, imaginary numbers, just because they're useful. They got folded into our mathematics. We're no longer in any doubt about their reality or non-reality. They're just part of the numbers. George Spencer Brown, the mathematician, introduced imaginary values into logic, and that hasn't spread widely yet, but it actually turns out to be a useful thing to do. There's been some engineering work done using imaginary values in logic, and so we're doing something similar here by saying, what if we could make use in a disciplined conversation of the notion that the brain is an organ of the imagination. Let's do an equation. So, There we go. That's what we're going to be asking about. And why would we attempt such a thing? Well, it's going to be my contention that the physicalist vocabulary is no good for addressing questions of consciousness, experience, and we've now got a conversation in which we can recognize that and wonder how to develop the conversation around experience. At this point, I'm going to make it very clear that I will not rely on any distinction between kinds of knowledge assumed to belong to the East or the West. Those are imaginary directions, the East and the West. West as science, East as all that Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and all that weird holistic religious stuff. No, we will not be doing that here. If we have urgent questions about experience, there's a lot of people who have developed questions about experience within traditions which come from different cultural realms, very far distant, oftentimes ones I'm totally unfamiliar with, so I'm going to be very naive going forward. But there are elaborated discussions of what consciousness is, how to understand one's position with respect to the cosmos, what it means to be alive, and what the best way to be alive is. These conversations are found throughout many traditions, always developed in a culturally specific form. But there's a great deal of commonality between them, and so here we're troubling something relevant to the notion of perennialism, which is sometimes a dangerous notion, the notion that there's a single underlying truth which all traditions are seeking to recover. We're not necessarily going to buy into that. But if we remain ignorant, sufficiently ignorant, we can nonetheless draw from such traditions, because one point becomes immediately clear. Light has been developed in a specific way within the physicalist tradition. As we survey accounts of consciousness experience, contemplation, meditative states, mystical states, madness, and so on, we'll find light recurring as the dominant metaphor. Light, in other words, we're not done with it in the physicalist frame, and the physicalist framework did a particular trick. It developed the notion of light in one particular way, leaving open the door to consideration of many other ways in which we might think of light. So what we want to do here is not interfere with any existing conversations. There's a new opportunity here in confronting the position of the embodied one with the physicalist framework. It's an opportunity to open doors, to open up new ways in which we can usefully draw from what humans, in their brilliance, in their imaginative brilliance, it's not just Kepler and the Parisians, everyone's been imaginative beings, and we're going to grant this genius of being someone who could come up with physics. We're going to grant that to the physicists. We're going to grant other people whopping great imaginations as well. So we paid homage to Kepler, but there's more to be found here. It seems like this might go on for a bit.